Hello there, I'm Tom, and you're listening to the America's Game edition of the Heavily Biased Top 10. With the rush of championship week and the release of playoff teams in our rearview, we get a chance to take a look into a game unlike any other. Whether through the responsibility of command or personally at risk in combat, only in games which are a part of the Commander-in-Chief Trophy will you see players who have all committed their lives to the preservation of your freedom. There are only a few rivalries which predate the 1890 beginning of Army versus Navy. Most of them come from the Ivy League, where the sport began to gain popularity in 1869. As the two oldest service academies come together for their 125th meeting, we invite you to sit back and enjoy the rivalry that almost wasn't, a rivalry which Navy leads by a mere 7 games, 62-55-7. These two first met on the field in 1890, and since then there have been only 10 years in which the two did not face one another on the gridiron. My first guess, and probably your first thought, would have been that the longest interruption in the game would have been during wartime, but that's not how this storied rivalry got its longest break. For that story, we should talk about the two service academies themselves before we take a trip all the way back to 1893, more than 10 years before Patton was even a cadet, and only 3 years after the first game between the two. The United States Military Academy, or Army, was first established in 1802 at West Point, New York, by President Thomas Jefferson as a training ground for officers in the rapidly expanding Army. Guarding from further incursion up the Hudson River, the fort at West Point was considered essential for the survival of the young United States, and was chosen in part for its fame from the Revolutionary War as George Washington's unconquered headquarters in the summer and fall of 1779. It is the oldest continuously occupied military post in the United States. West Point graduates have served in wars as far back as the War of 1812. The United States Naval Academy was the first of the two to play football. Although its foundation was recommended to Congress in 1825 by President John Quincy Adams, the later of the two service academies to be established wouldn't come into being until almost 20 years later. Annapolis, a healthy and secluded place, was chosen to keep midshipmen from the temptations and distractions of larger cities. Fort Severn was an Army base, and although it saw no military action, it protected the harbor of Annapolis, considered to be a key target for British forces during the War of 1812. Although no physical school had formally been funded by Congress, the design for the Naval Academy was in place during the presidency of James Polk. In 1845, Secretary of the Navy George Bancroft conducted a study of the law and found that his power as Secretary of the Navy allowed him to order the midshipmen who were at sea to be transferred to a place where they could wait for orders. He further concluded that he could direct instructors to give lessons while at sea. By law, that granted them the ability to follow the midshipmen to their place of common residence to continue their instruction. He thus ordered them to Annapolis, and when Congress reconvened the following year, they found a fully operational school already established. They granted money for the repair of buildings and continued operation of the Naval Academy. 45 years later, midshipmen from the Naval Academy would take on cadets from West Point, and only 3 years passed between that first game and the one that would threaten the history of the rivalry altogether. We will get there momentarily, but first we need to take a walk through my own visit to the United States Naval Academy. I had been on dozens of college campuses, but I never understood the atmosphere that this game is steeped in and the type of tradition that I would encounter. Short of taking your own tour, I'm not sure you can. To say that this rivalry is like any other diminishes the degree to which this game is ingrained in the culture of each academy, and that is a thing that I did not fully understand until I set foot on the grounds of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. There's something about walking the grounds of the academy that is different than the feel of every college campus that I've ever been on. As the university approaches the completion of its second century in operation, the timeless granite halls echo the courage, honor, and commitment of the midshipmen who have passed through here before. One of my first stops on campus was actually the tomb of Davy Jones underneath the chapel. As you exit the magnificent gray Maine granite, Bowock-style chapel and step out into the central courtyard facing the Severn River, you are surrounded by the institution that is the United States Naval Academy, the home and training grounds of roughly 4,500 students. Even on a late December afternoon, there is a fall-like crispness to the air. A massive residence hall and equally impressive academic halls flank your view, and even though the visit is out of season for the students, there is the sense that there is much more to these already stunning grounds than they seem. Across the courtyard laid out in front of you have walked everything from ensigns to admirals, governors, senators, congressmen, and even a president, all of whom know that these esteemed positions are not the true heroes of the academy. In another of these grand halls, I found those heroes. And as I, the uninitiated, read over the list, a former midshipman standing next to me clearly understands the moment. He waited until I had stepped back to take in the full effect. You know, many midshipmen have stood right there when they need a little perspective. I can see from the look in his face that he has stood here as well, much younger than we are now, learning a lesson that most people won't find in a lifetime. And in that moment, I understand too. In a place where the very architecture carries such formal grandeur, this place signifies something different. This place is duty. This place is a promise fulfilled at the greatest of all personal cost. The spirit of competition is evident in formal correspondence between graduates. It is on full display in front of faculty houses. It is as ubiquitous a call and response as any from the deep South where I'm from, except that it is spread across generations of both academy graduates and connected servicemen and women alike. It doesn't matter how quietly or loudly you say it around Annapolis, but a quick "Go Navy" will always find the response, "Beat Army." It is also the close to pre-meal grace, served family style in the massive dining hall. The Army-Navy matchup served as the dedication game for Chicago's iconic Soldier Field in 1926. The two institutions have met twice as the number 1 and number 2 ranked teams in the nation during World War II, with Army winning both games. After each game, both teams will join in the singing of the alma mater of each school to the corresponding student bodies. In addition to being a leg of the Commander-in-Chief Trophy, the two schools play for the prize of who will sing second, as the winning body has the honor of hearing their song sung last. There is a pre-game, formal prisoner exchange, where students studying away at the other academy are allowed to return home to enjoy the game with the student body of their fellow service members. The game saw innovations such as the first football helmet. It was worn by midshipman Joseph Mason Reeves, a man who would go on to become an admiral in the Navy. He wore the helmet because he had been advised that further blows to the head might result in disability or death. But back to our main story. The rivalry is only a few years into its history when it would have the kind of event that in modern times you can't even begin to make up. That story begins with a 6-4 Navy victory in Annapolis, one of only 7 games on an academy campus back in 1893. Even in the young history of the game, this was seen as an opportunity for bragging rights across the entire military, though this game was far from football as we now know it. The game itself was much more like rugby, and it would be more than a decade before the first documented forward pass. Formations like the Flying V, coupled with a complete lack of protective equipment, resulted in an astonishing number of sports-related injuries. West Point Chief Surgeon Major P.F. Harvey, upon documenting 97 cases of injury from the 1893 season alone, commented that it was doubtful that the good of the game outweighed the serious risk to life and limb. The game itself was played with waves of unpadded cadets and midshipmen crashing into one another play after play. Football was, at that point, a game with few rules and exploding popularity. What had been a crowd of only around 500 at the first game, only 3 years prior, had swelled to nearly 8,000 on that day in December. While the endings of games at the time were often cordial, the game of football itself was anything but. Fistfights at times broke out on the field between the canvas-clad Navy players and their Army opponents. Tensions of the contest spilled over into the crowd, And here is where accounts start to differ wildly, as this game happened in the early 1890s, a full 10 years before the Wright brothers managed to fly 180 feet. As such, some of this legend is probably lost to us forever. Some sources say that there was a raucous argument. Others called it as much of a free-for-all melee that broke out in the stands. But most state that amid the tempest, a brigadier general punched a rear admiral, who then challenged him to a duel. The only account that I could locate stated that the two eventually cooled off and decided that the fight to the death was not necessary. Superintendent of West Point, Oswald Ernst, who was a veteran of the Civil War, conducted his own investigation into the events of the game and concluded that football itself caused no real harm, but that the Army-Navy game was a bad influence and too much excitement carried over in ways that were out of control. So heated was the fracas surrounding this game that by February of 1894, President Grover Cleveland would hold a special cabinet meeting involving Secretary of the Navy Hillary A. Herbert and Secretary of War Daniel S. Lamont. Having spoken to Lamont earlier with the results of his investigation, Superintendent Ernst, through Lamont, persuaded Secretary Herbert that the rivalry should reach its end after only 4 meetings. They did not, however, agree to the end of football at the academies. Each institution would instead be allowed to play only home contests, thus ensuring that the two would never play one another again. It would be 1897 before football fan Teddy Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, penned a letter to Secretary of War Russell Alger, pleading his case for the rivalry to resume. Roosevelt's love for the game was such that he envisioned the need for reasonable boundaries and rules of engagement for eligibility so that the contest could be allowed to resume. 2 more years would pass before the game would resume in 1899 in Philadelphia, a neutral site, under President William McKinley. Interestingly, Roosevelt would come to the defense of football one more time in the form of pushing for increased institution of rules, the addition of eligibility requirements, and an increase of overall safety as the game faced increasing calls for an outright ban. The near-lawless game had spiked injuries and even player deaths across all forms of play over the next decade. Only 5 other seasons, 2 of them during World War I, have been without the annual matchup between Army and Navy, but the span between 1893 and 1899 remains the longest interruption for the game for the wildest reason. Since 1945, America's game has been an annual television staple, almost exclusively in a week unto itself. In addition to singing last, the winner of this matchup will take home the Commander-in-Chief trophy, as both Army and Navy have defeated the Air Force Academy during this season. That's our show for this week. Thank you so much for listening to the story of America's game. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed telling it. The Heavily Biased Top 10 will be back next week when we discuss bowl games and the National Championship playoff. The music this week is from the archives of the Navy Band and can be found at navyband.navy.mil. As dictated by tradition of the schools, music representing Navy was first, and music representing the Army was second. As someone who works in full-time service of veterans, if you are listening to this and you are a current or former member of the service, please know that you have my sincere thanks and gratitude. Thank you for your service, and thank you for all that you do. Until next time, thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, share, and let your friends know where you got the best information in all of college football.